SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
Now, as we build towards this weekend's G20 Leaders Summit, South Africa is set to bask in the international spotlight. Our national sports teams have certainly provided inspiration in that regard. The global roundtable of major developed and developing economies will exclude the United States, that has chosen an arm's length approach from this country's G20 presidency over an assertion that white Afrikaners bear the brunt of human rights abuses at the hands of a government that has rejected the allegations as devoid of fact. Among the global leaders attending are the presidents of France, Brazil, the EU, the German Chancellor, the AU Commission Chair, the UN Secretary General, and several prime ministers. But to give us more of what to expect over the next couple of days ahead, and it's a lot, believe us, and a much broader context, SABC News US correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease is here in South Africa, and he's here to do the coverage of the G20 Leaders Summit and everything leading up to it. It is such a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Wonderful to see you.
Can you believe we're here? I mean, it was just in September 2024. We took over from Brazil, and here we are at the end of 2025. I mean, this has been a lot of meetings in the lead up to the culmination of this Leaders Summit. But I mean, give us your idea of sort of from an external point of view, because I mean, you stay overseas. What has it been like?
Well, for South Africa, I think from my vantage point, it's been a situation where they've had to chew gum and walk at the same time. There's a bilateral relationship that is being frayed with the United States, while they're at the center of this multilateral process called the G20, where the United States is also a member. And so South Africa is, you know, in terms of South Africa's theme, right, the inclusivity around equity and sustainability and solidarity is very much an inclusive theme that is wrapped around the Sustainable Development Goals. And what you've had in that period is the ascendancy of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States, the world's largest economy, something that they have asserted since he has resumed his presidency in the White House. And what he has done in that time is to essentially say climate change is a hoax. They do no longer as a policy affirm the Sustainable Development Goals. They do not anymore affirm the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which is central to what South Africa is seeking to coalesce around, have member states coalesce around here at the G20 Summit. So it has been an extremely difficult lift for South Africa, given the fact that they're still negotiating a trade deal to bring down those 30% tariffs, right? So they're trying to do that. There's an economic equation at play in terms of the relationship with the United States. But in addition to that, there's this multilateral process where they've sought engagement to reach the broadest consensus, which the US has unfortunately undermined.
Yeah, and it is very unfortunate because, I mean, at the end of the day, there's a very ceremonial aspect to all of this, and this was South Africa handing that presidency over to the US.
As Brazil did to South Africa,
and
right?
we remember it very much so. What's going to happen? Like, how do you ceremoniously hand over to nobody? Because as far as we know, there's not going to be anybody representing the US.
But understand that the absence of the US doesn't necessarily mean the US is gone, right?
Yeah,
the US is still very much there. They've got to catch the ball.
Yeah.
Once that ball moves, whether it's going to be virtually, whether it's going to be in person. But the United States has been engaged at certain levels in this process. You know, Zane Dangor, the Sherpa and the Director General of the Department of International Relations, came to the United Nations in New York to brief member states. And he was telling me that right after that briefing, he was going to Washington because they were part of what is called the Troika. The Troika essentially is the past presidents, the current president, and the future president. So that then becomes South Africa, United States, and the United Kingdom moving forward. And that's kind of the nucleus of how the G20 agenda is transferred, and where you hold people accountable in terms of what was decided before, what you're deciding now, and moving forward. So that Troika is going to move forward with South Africa, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Yeah. What that looks like, I don't know, but South Africa certainly has done its level best, certainly from our perspective, to engage, not to counterpunch necessarily when the United States criticizes. South Africa has presented facts in terms of the Afrikaner question. They've said that the United States is wrong on that, but they still want to engage on many other issues, and that's been the complication for Pretoria in this exercise.
I don't want to only focus on the US because, of course, there are so many other leaders and invited leaders that are coming, and organizations, and this is a very important meeting. But I do want to just sort of perhaps frame this and say, is the summit being overshadowed in some way by something that has never happened before? I mean, I don't imagine that there's ever been a host country that has had the next country hosting been so sort of against that particular country. Has it happened before? And, you know, is it overshadowing the summit somewhat?
It's uncharted waters.
Yeah.
And look, if Donald Trump had come to the summit, that also would have sucked the oxygen out of the room. He travels with a massive press corps. Sometimes they're not on topic in terms of the questions he asks. He would have done a press conference. So in a way, to get to the substance and not to have too much opposition in the room, it's probably a good thing that the United States is not here, because they might be able to, you know, not have the spanner in the works when they address issues about climate justice, or when they address issues around beneficiation in terms of critical minerals. And so the United States could have been a spanner in those works. But look, they are going to get a handover from South Africa, whether it's virtually, whether it's an empty chair in South Africa. But as you well mentioned, as your introduction demonstrated, there are going to be very important people here from across the spectrum.
Yes.
And in a world of multipolarity, you know, you've got the Indonesians here, you've got the Turkish president here, and so you've got Brazil here, and that talks to the multipolarity that the world is engaging with and wrapping its arms around, and where the United States fits into that. To be absent from a meeting like this matters.
It does.
They're not going to have the inside scoop here as to what's going on, and so as President Ramaphosa said, it's their loss.
It is, in a way, their loss, because,
it
I
is.
there is a lot that's going to be discussed here. I mean, I'm looking at a list, and anything can change at any time in terms of who is going to be attending, who isn't going to be attending. But we know France will be here, Germany, Brazil, the UK, Italy, Japan, India, Canada. I think the new
Prime Minister
Prime
Carney.
Minister, South Korea, Turkey. Even Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince is expected, who happens to be
in the United States right now.
Having dinner with Ronaldo and Tim Cook and all of these, Elon Musk. I saw these photographs doing the round yesterday. So, you know, everything is very ironic at the moment. It really is. But these are some of the powerful nations, including the EU, and a lot of other invited guests are coming. Big decisions are hopefully going to be made here.
Yeah, and I mean, remember that you know, when South Africa took on this theme, it was very much closely aligned with the agenda of the Secretary General of the United Nations, which essentially is the development agenda. Things about poverty, food security, disaster risk, resilience, right? In a world of climate catastrophe, how are we fortifying our cities and our towns to mitigate the impacts of those disasters? When you talk about the critical mineral future, you know, the supply chains around critical minerals, the beneficiation around that, how is the African continent going to position itself in this AI future, where these critical minerals are going to be essential for data centers, for communications technology, for the future of electric vehicles and robotics. I mean, this is an economic question, right? This is an economic summit, which is the G20, but the development aspect has become increasingly important, and that's what South Africa is focused on. So they're going to be very important discussions about the future and where we go here. And for the US not to be in the room, that will hurt them in the long term. But maybe, you know, they take over the presidency and they adopt some of the decisions. Who knows?
Who knows? And that's exactly what you say, uncharted waters. And let's talk China for a moment, because we know that Xi Jinping is not going to be present, but obviously they are sending a delegation. And I don't think, but you please tell me, I mean, I'm not sure we can read much into the fact that he's not coming, because I don't think he does travel too much to these major functions. But China is a vital role in all of this, whether we look at China, Russia, also Vladimir Putin not able to be here as well. But let's talk to those two nations.
Look, you know, China is one example, right? Look who's going to, the Premier, the Prime Minister is coming, so the number two is coming. I mean, it's not a slight on South Africa. But Xi Jinping doesn't go to the UN General Assembly every year, neither does Vladimir Putin, for different reasons. But often these leaders don't go to summits. That is a fact. But understand that China in the room, France in the room, the EU in the room, Carney in the room, Canadian Prime Minister, Mexico's President Sherwin. These are people that have also been on the receiving end of Donald Trump's wrath, the President of the United States. So that kind of camaraderie that you have in the room in terms of being on the receiving end of U.S. bilateral, unilateral policy, be that on tariffs, be that on criticism, be that on, you know, the tweets, being on the receiving end of Donald Trump's social media posts. South Africa is not unique in that sense. So I think you're going to get a lot of backslapping and handshakes and quiet conversations about what is going on and how you cross that bridge with the United States, because everybody's been on the receiving end, not just China. But of course, the second largest economy, to your question, the second largest economy in the world that has really been able to use its economic might to push back at the United States. And you've seen some compromises from Washington and Beijing in that regard. And so interesting to have a conversation with the Premier of China to say, how are you guys doing this? And maybe we can learn some lessons.
Yeah, and that's what's important, because lessons need to be learnt in this room. And other lessons need to be learnt as well, because if there's one thing that's happened this year, there has been a seismic shift in the world and the configuration of power and how things are looking. And we know this. Something like this is going to even change that further. I mean, when you look at the face of power and how it is changing, how do you think this G20, the leaders' meeting, is going to change the face of power in this world?
You know, when you talk about power today, I think the best example to look at is how we are dealing with conflicts around the world and how are we addressing the situation in Gaza moving forward. The issue of Ukraine. There are many, you know, the proliferation of conflicts on Africa, right? The 2030 goal of silencing the guns really looks very fragile if you look at what's going on in places like Sudan, what's going on in South Sudan as well. There's a precarious situation evolving there. The DRC is a long-standing challenge. And so even though the G20 is not the premier body for solving geopolitical processes and conflicts, that's the mandate and the purview of the UN Security Council, there is no development unless you deal with the conflicts. I think Trevor Manuel said that in an interview with Sophie Mokoena yesterday, that you've got to deal with the conflicts because it impugns the development process. You cannot address poverty. You cannot address food security. I mean, look at food security in Gaza, in Sudan today, right? If you have bombs dropping, you're certainly not planting vegetables. And so that is the dynamic that you have to see here. How are we going to address those conflicts so that we can actually implement the things we are going to decide at this conference as it relates to critical minerals, as it relates to food security, disaster resilience, innovation, infrastructure, all that matters. But the guns have to stop firing bullets and bombs have to stop dropping.
Yeah, they have to. And as you say, I mean, the world is in a state in terms of different wars that have deafened us, and Gaza being under the spotlight. Of course, a plane full of Palestinians arriving in South Africa no doubt is also coming under discussion.
Which was a question to Donald Trump yesterday in the White House alongside the Crown Prince, and he quickly pivoted to South Africa and that there's extermination happening in South Africa and didn't really answer the question.
Okay.
Sorry, sorry. You didn't get an answer.
We'll go for coffee after this. That's, of course, Sherwin, Bryce-Pease. That is what you can expect coming up. It is going to be an incredibly interesting couple of days, and we're so happy to have you here in South Africa. Let's take a break. See you after this.